Welcome to The Debate. Our focus today is on, spontaneous communication, specifically how expert knowledge can be deployed clearly, instantly, even when you're hit with an unprepared question. We're digging into this 3-2-1 framework. It's a technique that's been put forward to essentially enforce structure and stop that cognitive paralysis that leads to rambling.
Right, that mechanism. 3 steps, 2 types, 1 thing. It's certainly interesting because it promises to stop the expert brain from, scattering its resources when put on the spot, opening a dozen browser tabs, as the source material puts it.
Exactly. But this idea, this promise of instant structure, it forces us to ask the real question here. Does the 3-2-1 framework fundamentally enhance spontaneous intellectual communication by providing that necessary structure and speed? Or does its required simplification actually compromise the depth, the nuance that we expect in expert discourse?
Well, I'm going to argue that for someone who's already an established expert, the rigidity of 3-2-1 can actually be a liability. Sure, it might be great for achieving simple, immediate clarity, I get that. But imposing such a strict numerical structure on complex thought, it inherently risks making nuanced responses sound superficial, or even manufactured. I think we need to prioritize intellectual integrity over just structural neatness.
Okay, I see why you'd prioritize integrity. That makes sense. But I'd argue this framework is essential precisely because it's a structural intervention. The core problem often for a knowledgeable speaker isn't a lack of content. It's the inability to deploy it swiftly, clearly, under pressure. Right? So the 3-2-1 structure, it provides that immediate cognitive relief. It gives deep knowledge a clear channel to flow through, stopping that, descent into just disorganized thoughts.
I'm sorry, I'm not fully convinced that the structural relief outweighs the potential intellectual cost. For a novice speaker, perhaps, yes, it stops the scrambling, the panic, but we're talking about expert exchange here. The moment you constrain complex analysis into these mandatory steps, or boiling it down to a single one thing, you're basically choosing rapid delivery over comprehensive thought. Why should an expert feel they have to reduce the scope of their analysis just to fit some prefabricated template?
Because without some kind of template, that knowledge often stays locked away, inaccessible to the listener in the moment. Think about the objective. It's to communicate your deep knowledge effectively, right now. This framework ensures the speaker presents clear, organized points. It projects competence instantly. The structure is just, it's an organizational tool. It doesn't dictate what your knowledge is, only how it gets delivered.
But the mechanism itself seems to prioritize speed. The source material talks about formulating a response in, 3 seconds? That kind of pressure, it almost forces simplification. Let's try to ground this in a real-world expert scenario. Say I'm asked to spontaneously analyze a complex new climate model. If I have to distill my entire response down to a single one thing like, this model shows warming is accelerating, I inevitably sacrifice crucial caveats. Things about data reliability, regional differences, maybe the limitations of the input parameters. The complexity is the point of the expertise, isn't it?
That's a fair point. It's a compelling scenario, though I might frame it a bit differently. That 3-second challenge, I see it more about building agility. It guarantees some coherent output rather than the alternative, which is often going blank, or worse, delivering this opaque, context-free ramble. For an audience, honestly, a structured, high-level analysis that clearly states the core findings is probably infinitely more valuable than an unorganized brain dump of every single relevant variable.
But you seem to be prioritizing coherence over the actual quality of the content. If those necessary contextual limitations get stripped out just to meet the structural requirement, isn't the resulting clarity potentially misleading? Is the framework maybe just prioritizing the speaker's confidence over an accurate representation of a complex reality? Expert analysis often involves qualifying statements. The 2 types might simply be insufficient to contain the necessary counterarguments or the dependent variables that really define true expertise.
I think the clarity provided by the structure actually elevates the perceived value of the answer. If the speaker's already deeply knowledgeable, the structure allows that knowledge to be accessible, understandable. It's about intellectual hygiene, really, making sure what's in your head gets out clearly. And we also need to consider the scope of application here.
Yes, let's talk scope. The source material mentions things like Q&A sessions, social media content as primary use cases.
Exactly. And that broad application, I think, proves its reliability as a fallback strategy. The material notes its utility when there's very little time to prep. And this isn't just for beginners, right? It says even experienced communicators still use it to ensure they have structure in those low-prep, high-pressure moments.
Okay, but social media and Q&A, they often reward brevity, that immediate punchiness, over exhaustive analysis. What happens when the context shifts? Let's say you're debating fiscal policy in a serious public forum, or you're defending a major scientific finding to peers. Do these constraints still work? Imagine trying to argue the merits of a new financial regulation. Can you really categorize the multi-layered impacts into just two types? Regulatory impacts are seldom binary. That kind of rigid constraint, it feels like it severely limits your ability to address edge cases or conceptual ambiguities, which are often the hallmarks of advanced discourse.
But why must it limit? I see the structure as conceptually elastic. The two types could be, say, Type A, impacts on market liquidity, and Type B, impacts on consumer protection. The 3 steps could be something like, Step 1, state the primary objective. Step 2, address key stakeholder concerns. Step 3, project likely long-term stability. The framework demands organization, sure, but not necessarily simplification of the underlying research. It's a mechanism for delivering the content effectively, not diluting it.
But the very act of forcing, let's say, highly dimensional data into a predefined numerical category, it risks distorting the reality you're trying to convey. True expert discourse relies so heavily on necessary caveats, acknowledgments of uncertainty. If you spend one of your precious 3 steps just defining primary objectives, you have less space, less time to discuss the empirical uncertainty that might actually undermine that objective. Forcing essential nuance into one single constrained step, well, it often strips away the very intellectual precision required.
I'd argue precision is more often the victim of disorganization, not structure. If the default response under pressure is just intellectual clutter, a disorganized ramble, then the 3-2-1 structure is actually the key to preserving the precision you value. It provides that, let's call it, minimum viable communication template needed to articulate complex ideas before the mental panic really sets in.
I guess I come at it from a slightly different angle, thinking about the development of spontaneous thinking itself. While frameworks like this definitely offer immediate benefits, could relying too heavily on them actually inhibit the development of genuine, flexible, spontaneous thinking? True mental agility, shouldn't that allow an expert to navigate complexity without needing to constantly plug their thoughts into these prefabricated slots? I sometimes worry this framework might become a kind of cognitive crutch, stopping an expert from evolving past somewhat mechanical responses.
I'm not sure I'm convinced by that cognitive crutch argument. Look at it more like high-level professional training. Think about high-stakes, time-sensitive fields. Aviation, crisis management, they all rely on structured checklists, response templates. This is sort of the intellectual equivalent. It's not about hiding incompetence. It's about providing the structural blueprint needed to access and articulate deep knowledge quickly and clearly. And by providing this immediate success, making the speaker feel more effective, maybe even more excited to communicate, as the source says, that positive feedback loop could foster better, more organic communication habits over time.
The checklist analogy is interesting, it's apt in some ways, but checklists are typically used when the situation is already fairly well defined. The parameters are somewhat fixed. Spontaneous intellectual inquiry, though, often involves defining the problem while you're speaking. If an expert constantly defaults to the simple one-thing answer in a truly high-stakes, conceptually fuzzy setting, aren't they choosing structural compliance over genuine intellectual thoroughness?
And I would still contend that structural compliance in those moments enables the perceived thoroughness under pressure. It's the essential bridge between possessing deep knowledge and being able to actually deliver that deep knowledge persuasively, clearly, when the clock is ticking. The framework solves the delivery problem, which then allows the expert to focus their mental energy on the content itself.
It solves the delivery problem, I'll grant you that, yes. But we must remain aware, I think, of the potential intellectual ceiling that this kind of numerical mandate might place on handling true conceptual ambiguity.
So wrapping up my view, I maintain that the 3-2-1 framework is a powerful and actually remarkably simple solution. It directly addresses that immediate threat of intellectual opacity, of rambling. It allows speakers to deploy their knowledge clearly, sound authoritative, which is just paramount when time or prep is limited. For me, it's structure as freedom, in a way.
And from my perspective, I agree it's a brilliant tactical tool, excellent for immediate clarity, for projecting competence, organizing thoughts for maximum impact in certain situations. But those engaging in truly high-level intellectual exchange need to be acutely wary of sacrificing necessary nuance, necessary complexity, just for the sake of adhering strictly to 3 steps, 2 types, 1 thing.
Ultimately, the listener has to weigh those benefits, that instant, structured clarity, against the specific demands of their communication context. This framework isn't meant to replace robust research or deep thought, obviously, but to ensure the effective, rapid articulation of that research when preparation is minimal or zero.
Indeed. And recognizing that different speaking situations call for different balances, different degrees of structure versus depth. That's key. The material, I think, offers really valuable insight into that critical trade-off between speed, structure, and intellectual integrity in spontaneous communication. Lots to think about there.